welcome back in. Today we're going to discuss our top streaming options for both defense and kickers. Let's go ahead and get right to it. We're going to start with the defenses. Now, I want to hit on a couple of my top 12 defenses of the week. And we're going to start with the Houston Texans. Now, through 3 weeks, the Texans are currently the DST 17, averaging 6 fantasy points per game. The Texans' schedule to start the season has been rough with games against the Rams, Bucks, and Jags. However, their favorite turns this week with the Titans coming to town. Cam Ward and the Titans have allowed a 28% pressure rate, has already been sacked a league high 15 times. Not shockingly, the Titans have allowed the most fantasy points to opposing defenses. The Texans are my number one defense of the week. Next up is going to be the Vikings, coming off a monster performance where they produced 4 sacks, 2 INTs, 3 fumble recoveries, and 2 touchdowns for 30 fantasy points. Brian Flores and his defense now travel to Dublin to take on a Steelers offense that have yielded the 4th highest pressure rate on the season. The Vikings are in another solid spot again this week. And then lastly, want to hit on the Denver Broncos. Now, they had a bounce back performance in week 3 against the Red Hot Chargers. They produced 5 sacks, 2 turnovers for 9 fantasy points. They currently rank as the DST 9 on the season and will now get to face Jake Browning and the Bengals. Browning, since taking over as QB, has turned the ball over 5 times in 2 games. The Bengals' offensive line is absolutely dreadful, allowing a pressure on 23% of dropbacks. That has allowed 3.5 sacks per game. The Broncos are a top 3 defense in week 4. Now, let's move on to some of my streaming options that I wanted to hit on. First, we're going to start with the Chargers, only rostered in 37% of leagues. The Chargers defense has been very good to start the season. While they haven't quite gotten there on sacks, they have limited opposing offenses, just 16.7 points per game, which is the 4th lowest rate in the league. They've also turned the ball over on 10% of offensive drives, which ranks top 13. Next up for the Chargers, a matchup against the Giants, who have looked inept most of the year. The Giants have allowed a pressure on 19.5% of dropbacks, which is the 7th highest rate, as well as the 13th most fantasy points to the defense to start the season. The Chargers are my favorite streaming option of the week. Next up is going to be the Commanders, and they're rostered in just 32% of leagues. They are currently the DST 12 through 3 weeks. And they do have 2 top 12 performances under their belt already. They currently rank top 10 in pressure rate and have 9 sacks. They have 4 0 turnovers, which is a scenario they do need to improve upon. But next up is a matchup against the Falcons offense that hasn't really taken off yet. In fact, they've allowed 9.7 fantasy points per game to opposing defenses, which is the 7th highest rate, making the Commanders a top 12 defense for me this week. Lastly, let's talk about the New England Patriots, who are rostered in only 12% of leagues, despite being a top 12 DST so far this season. They currently have the 5th most sacks, the 7th most INTs, and they have done so without arguably their best defensive player in Christian Gonzalez. Next up, the Patriots is a matchup against the Panthers. The Panthers have actually done a pretty good job of protecting Bryce Young, who has only allowed a sack on 4.3% of his dropbacks. However, Bryce Young and the offense have struggled with turnovers. The Panthers have allowed the 10th most fantasy points to opposing defense. The Pats, a solid streaming option. Now let's move over to the kicker position, and we're going to start with a couple of my top guys that I want to hit on. One, I just want to talk about Brandon Aubrey, because who doesn't want to talk about Brandon Aubrey? But he continues to be the best kicker in the league. He currently is averaging 13.7 fantasy points per game and is the kicker 3 through 3 weeks. He's converted all 8 of his field goals, including a monster 64-yarder in week 2 against the Giants. He's already converted 7 field goals of 40-plus yards, and there is no better kicker in fantasy right now than Brandon Aubrey, who is well on his way to 3 straight seasons of double-digit production. Next up is going to be Tyler Loop. He was one of my favorite sleeper kickers during the season, and he's certainly come through. It never made sense to me why a kicker for the Ravens was so widely available, but he's paid off, converting 100% of his field goals so far while scoring 12.7 fantasy points per game, which is the kicker 4 overall. Next up for Ravens and Tyler Loop is a matchup against the Chiefs, who have yielded 8 fantasy points per game to kickers. And then lastly, I just want to talk about Harrison Butker, who's starting to draw some concern locally in Kansas City. He's now missed 4 field goals over the last 2 weeks. On the season, he's just converted 77% of his attempts, which ranks 23rd among all kickers. The Chiefs have way too much money invested in him to move on, but it is certainly something to monitor. For fantasy purposes, though, Butker is still a top 8 kicker, averaging 10.3 fantasy points per game. Now, let's move over to my streaming options. And we have quite a few players on this list, but I think it's a lot of it just because so many of these kickers are still widely available, and maybe they shouldn't be. First is going to be Jason Myers versus the Arizona Cardinals. Myers is averaging 11.3 fantasy points per game and is a top 5 kicker. Despite that, he's only rostered in 4.6% of leagues. He's converted 86% of his field goals. He has 4 field goals of 40-plus yards and has attempted the most PATs. Myers has never been a sexy option, but he's routinely consistent and ranks top 5 in attempts from the money zones of 40 and 50-plus yards. Myers is a good spot this week on the road against the Cardinals. Next up is going to be Spencer Shrader versus LA Rams. I know it's early, but Shrader is quietly the number one overall kicker in fantasy. I don't know how sustainable this is, as he has yet to attempt a field goal of 50-plus yards, which is usually not a receipt for success for today's kickers. But through 3 games, he's converted 91% of his field goals, and he's tied with the most field goals and PATs, which is why he's averaging 15 fantasy points per game. If the Colts continue their success offensively, then Shrader should be a top 10 kicker rest of season. And this week, the Colts travel to LA to take on the Rams. Rams have allowed the 6th most fantasy points to kickers. Shrader's easily in play. It should be rostered in more than 10% of leagues. Next up is going to be Matt Prater, who was signed once Tyler Bass got placed on IR to start the year. Prater has come in and provided stability at the position. He's converted 87% of his field goals and all of his PATs. Obviously, kicking for one of the best offenses in the league, and the Bills has its perks. He's currently a top 5 kicker on the season, averaging 11.3 fantasy points per game. And he gets an incredible game environment this week against the Saints. We have yielded the 3rd most fantasy points to kickers. Next up is going to be Will the Thrill Reichard for me. Now, he had plenty of struggles late last year, and many weren't sure if he would hold on to the job heading into 2025. Well, so far, he's proven the haters wrong and has converted all of his field goals, including a 62-yarder. He's currently the kicker 7 in fantasy points per game, averaging 10.3. As long as he maintains this level of production, he'll be a weekly top 10 kicker rest of season and makes for a very solid streaming option this week against the Steelers in Dublin. And then next up is going to be Eddy Pineiro. Is only rostered in 1% of leagues. The longtime Panthers kicker was added after Jake Moody once again struggled in week 1 for the 49ers. Since being signed, he's averaged 11 fantasy points per game. He's converted all of his field goals, including a long of 51 yards. Now, he has missed 1 PAT, but as long as he's kicking for the 49ers, he's going to be a viable streaming option. Next up is a matchup against the Jags and is a top 12 kicker for me this week. And with that being said, if you have any questions for your kickers or defenses, be sure to leave them in the comments section below. We'll be sure to get to them. We'll answer any question you have. We'll see you on the next one. Bye.